The 90s was an odd time for video games. Technology, demographics, genres, it was all kind of going through a strange and entropic state, where gaming was no longer just a hobby for kids and nerds, but something that can cater to almost anyone. And at the same time, there was a massive leap in technology changing what was even possible, with 3D graphics and in-game environments shattering the previous standards of what could and couldn't be done in a video game. To top all this off, the late 90s was also the tail end of the mascot platformer boom, where countless companies, big and small, were trying to create the next Sonic or Mario. And while many of these games would flop or create forgettable short-lived series like Bubsy and Gex, there was a handful of forgotten gems lost in the fog, and one of these is the adorable dream-themed Klonoa Door to Phantomile. A wonderful little game left in the dust due to it coming out at the end of the aforementioned mascot platformer boom. Maybe due to its childish looks that might have put off older players, its at times rage-inducing difficulty that most kids probably would have hated. Maybe it was the 2.5D graphics being a little outdated at this point. Look, there's a whole plethora of reasons and excuses for why Klonoa didn't reach the mass love and adoration it deserved, but that's neither here nor there. Klonoa is the definition of a hidden gem. From its simple but heartfelt story, charming and enduring characters, great use of music and atmosphere, and simple but fun gameplay, there's a lot to praise. Considering an HD remaster of the series' 2 mainline games has recently been put up on Steam, I thought it would be a good idea to give the game the love and recognition it's always deserved. While it might not be everyone's cup of tea, there's quite a bit to love here, and there's a surprising amount of heart that makes this entire experience a very enduring and worthwhile one. So let's make up for lost time here, and let's talk about an overlooked classic. Let's talk about Klonoa Door to Phantomile. This game had a bit of an odd development cycle, where nowhere near the clusterfuck that made up Halo Combat Evolved or Bubsy 3D, it did have quite a bit of major changes and evolutions throughout its development. I mean, originally Klonoa looked like this. The game was the brainchild of Hideo Yoshizawa. It was actually supposed to be a fairly serious story-based game in its original form, themed around robots and ancient ruins. Though this era of the project wouldn't last very long and would ultimately be dropped, and from here the character would start to take form in a way that better resembles its final output, mostly thanks to the fantastic art of Yoshihiko Arai. Klonoa would be redesigned as a cat-like creature in a more dark fantasy-looking setting. And if we're going off the original concept art, it looks like he was fighting some sort of werewolf-type creatures, but this concept would also be dropped in favor of the more dream fantasy world of Phantomile and enemies that resemble Kirby rejects. Namco also wanted the game to have more of a mass appeal behind it, aimed at adults and children alike. And while publisher overhead usually suggests terrible ideas that ruin games, in the case of Klonoa, it's kind of where the identity of it was born, as Yoshizawa would write the story and the plot twists and elements that would be far more mature than the colorful graphics and simplistic gameplay would really lead on to. The other key aspect to the development of the game was its theme of dreams, with Yoshizawa being quoted as saying this: "I was struck by the idea that when you wake up sometimes in the morning and you know you had a dream but you can't remember what it was. Obviously the dream went somewhere, at least my way of thinking. I thought, I wonder where these dreams go. What if all these dreams that are lost when people wake up but they can't remember are carried away and collected somewhere like some sort of energy?" This dream direction would lead to a further focus on the weird but cute aesthetics of the game, as Yoshizawa wanted to make the whole thing feel familiar, as if the worlds and situations could be something anyone could have had appeared in their dreams. Though, funny enough, this is probably why the game has such a Japanese identity to it. Despite its French influences in both character design and language, The closest game aesthetically to Klonoa would be Knights, but mostly just in the ethereal and dreamy aesthetics and Knight's jester outfit. Upon release, the game would review fairly well and sell a fair amount of copies, but it and its sequel would never really get the fanfare that they deserved, staying much more cult beloved than mainstream success Namco was looking for, ultimately leading to the game's more obscure identity today. The story of Klonoa was written like a typical children's game, with a mostly light-hearted adventure with cartoonish villains threatening to plunge the world into eternal darkness, although in this case, that's quite literal. The game is also host to some oddly heartfelt moments and a twist that, well, it's a bit obvious, one that no less stands as a bit tragic and honestly very perplexing to be written into a game as colorful and childish as this one. So consider this a spoiler warning for anyone that is that concerned about it.
You fucking nerd!
You play as the titular Klonoa, a strange cat-like creature with an incredibly stylish design who inhabits the world of Phantomile, a dimension that exists in the realm of dreams. Klonoa lives a simple life with his supposed grandpa and his friend, annoying little shit, Hupao, a playful spirit who lives inside the ring Klonoa wields. In the lead up to the game, it's shown that our feline friend is having consistent nightmares about an aircraft crashing into the side of a mountain, and one morning, it actually happens. Our dynamic duo decide to investigate the crash, learning along the way from a tower guard about a powerful diva named Lafis, whose singing brings rebirth to the land of dreams. When the pair finally make it to the top of the mountain, they find that Lafis has been knocked out by the game's antagonist, Cutest, a powerful entity who once reigned as the king of the Moon Kingdom, as well as his juggalo manservant Joka.
Magic everywhere in this bitch.
Cutest kidnaps Lafis and orders Joka to kill Klonoa and Hupao once he notices them, and after a brief boss fight, the juggalo makes his escape and Klonoa finds the moon pendant that they were originally looking for. From here, the game's adventure really starts, with the pendant being left with Grandpa and him sending Klonoa and Hupao out to seek out Granny, who knows about what's going on. Throughout the majority of the game, you're sent out to find various key figures and save them from the possessions and perversions of Joka and Cutest, as well as get information that leads you ever closer to Granny. And once you find her, you are set into a boss fight where Joka finds out that you left the pendant with your grandpa and he goes to steal it. On the race back, you get there just in time to see your grandfather get drone striked like a Palestinian hospital. All jokes aside, it's here where the game's story shows a bit of its hand. Regardless of its childish art style and dialogue, the game isn't afraid to kill off characters and show grief. And when paired with the previous themes of possession and corruption, it's a much more mature game thematically than its cover and art style would ever let on. From here, you make your way to the Sun Temple and ascend up to the Moon Kingdom to face off against Cutest and Joka. Once you do, you find out that Hupao isn't actually who you thought he was. Upon meeting the Queen of the Moon Kingdom, you find out that Hupao isn't actually the obnoxious Navi clone he's pretending to be, but rather the odd love child between Tinky Winky and the Blue Power Ranger. Honestly, this really took me out of the entire game, because seeing this motherfucker go from being the obnoxious little shit that he was to a completely different obnoxious piece of shit, the game's character designs are pretty good for the most part, but this is just one of those decisions I will never understand. From here, some turmoil and distrust within Klonoa becomes apparent, but given the brevity of the situation, he sets it aside in order to stop the world from ending. It's also here where we see what fate has befallen Lafis, now trapped in a giant egg being fed with energy and essences of nightmares. After facing off against Joka and finally meeting face to face with Cutest, it's revealed by Cutest himself that Klonoa was some sort of guardian that kept him at bay all of these years. He also reveals that his ultimate goal was revenge for the years he was kept asleep, only to suffer in nightmares. When confronted about how he will also cease to exist along with everyone else when his plan comes to fruition, and in another dark and mature direction of the story, Cutest responds with this.
Consider love, but the love full and want. This was full and want. The lobotomize.
The nihilistic depression that consumed Cutest has set him on a quest of not only self-destruction, but apocalypse. And even after being beaten by Klonoa, he's still happy to see that the monster has hatched from the egg and begins its course of destruction. Though after being beaten in the most frustrating boss fight of the game, the world is saved and returns to its normal state. It's here where the game hits us with what is genuinely a depressing twist, hinted at during the final level. Hugh regrettably reveals that he stole Klonoa from his actual world, implanting a lifetime of memories to make him believe that the two were best friends, and that this world was his home in order to get him to fight to save it. As Klonoa reacts in denial and heartbreak to this reveal, Laphise begins to sing her song, restoring the world to its previous state, in turn sending Klonoa back to his home. Now that's pretty fucking dark for a cute little kid's game, isn't it? But given that this was the late 90s, it's a bit par for the course considering Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, Rayman 2, and Conker's Bad Fur Day all came out from this era. Klonoa was written in a way that was supposed to attract both children and adults alike, with cute art and aesthetics, and a story filled with mature themes. And this is actually one of the main reasons this game was remembered, because it dealt with nihilism, grief, revenge, and deception in a way most family-oriented titles would never risk attempting. It's nothing close to gut-wrenching for an adult, but if a kid played this game, it would probably be a tearjerker for them. And as an adult and child myself, I actually really like the story of Klonoa. It definitely has some of the most annoying voice acting I've ever heard and some very cringy dialogue. But overall, the depth that they put into the villain as well as the twists I genuinely didn't see coming made it a refreshing story to go through, especially as a platformer since most of the time story is a bit of an afterthought in these games. But what really sells a story is the fantastic art style and music that complements it. But we'll get there when we get there. If you'll allow me a minute to shill, I'd like to take a second to beg you for some money. Now, I'm no different from every other content creator who wants to shill their Patreon, but since I cover music-related topics and actually play snippets of the music I cover, most of my video catalog is unmonetizable. So if you enjoy the content I make and you want to support it, please consider throwing me $1 or $2 on Patreon. Regardless of how much, I'm going to keep putting these videos out as I genuinely enjoy to make them, but every bit of support helps. If you would all enjoy the content or music or anything that I create, please consider supporting. I couldn't thank you enough. You have my gratitude. The gameplay of Klonoa is a great showcase of how to take simple mechanics and continually bend and exploit them to keep things fresh throughout the entire game. It takes a similar 2.5D approach that Crash Bandicoot did, but executes it a lot differently. Rather than jumping being the name of the game here, it's Klonoa's trademark mechanic of grabbing enemies and using them as projectiles and double jumps. And the 2.5D approach to its world is also vastly different from how other games handle it, letting it add to the spectacle of the levels in an odd geometric style, spiraling around the level. Klonoa really takes a lot with its gameplay, with elements of Kirby, Crash, Mario, and even Sonic when it comes to its level design being apparent. But none of these influences feel overly dominating, allowing Klonoa's approach to platforming to feel unique when experienced. What sets it apart from many other games of its generation, however, is its constant addition of new mechanics, with every level adding in new enemy types, jumping mechanics, etc., though it never gets too crazy outside of these sections. Fuck these sections. That being said, some of these mechanics translate better than others, and it can add to some frustrating sections from time to time, as Klonoa isn't as easy as you might think. Far from a torture platformer, the game can get pretty challenging from time to time, especially with its more time-based sections like I previously mentioned. But as challenging as it gets, Rayman it is not. Outside of its unique take on the 2.5D perspective, the Wind Ring plays a key role in the game's combat and platforming mechanics. It can be used to grab enemies to kill others, as well as double jump, with the timing of your throw and jump affecting the length and height. With the Kirby influence coming in with how certain enemy types can be used for different types of movement, with most acting as basic jumps, and others allowing you to helicopter in the air for a short distance. The game also has a light collectathon element as well, with various eggs and villagers that can be found, but unless you're going for 100% completions or high point values, it's not really all that necessary to beat a level and can ultimately be ignored if you just don't care. The only other element of note we're talking about is the boss fights. Although, if I'm being honest, they're very underwhelming. Each boss fight is relatively the same, where you either run back and forth or in a circle against a giant enemy and wait for your time to strike. It's serviceable, but compared to the rest of the game, they leave quite a bit to be desired, but to be fair, a lot of other games around the same era did the same thing, with their boss fights just kind of being there to be there. Which is a shame, because Klonoa does actually have some pretty fun boss fights in its final section, with Gaudius and Nahatum, or however you say it, bringing in some much needed challenge and mechanical depth to the mix. But like I said, that's few and far between, with most of the bosses being just another take on what the very first one was. Aesthetics, music, and art design are where Klonoa truly shines. What actually drew me into this game was its art style and music. I'm a sucker for Y2K era art styles, and Klonoa, even from just his character design, has all of that. But the world and enemies have this extremely unique and distinct look to them as well. It's honestly just really charming and does a lot of heavy lifting in setting the game apart from its contemporaries. The world itself is less Y2K, but carries a unique dream aesthetic that becomes more and more dominating as the game goes on. And to be fair, if I have any real criticism that I can make about the game as a whole, it's that its gameplay, music, art style, story, everything about it flounders in its first hour or so. I mean, just look at this. The music is obnoxious and grating, the world is very boring and just played out. It looks like everything else that came out in this era, and the gameplay itself is just very bland. Now, compare that to this. Yeah, that's a bit of a night and day difference there, isn't it? Plus, the music on the first level is fucking ear-grating. Stop! And this is all just a real shame considering how cool the whole thing eventually gets. The music changes as the game goes on to be much more ethereal and progressive, eschewing the generic fantasy music into genuinely beautiful tracks like this. And they do a lot to elevate the immersion and overall tone of the game. The subtle, somber elements of the music play up on the themes of grief and nihilism sprinkled all throughout the game's story, as well as the upbeat and fun boss fight music make some of the most frustrating portions all that much easier to deal with. And again, I can't praise the game's music enough. Once it starts to get going, the combination of jazz, funk, progressive, and electronics create this hazy and ethereal sound that really is like nothing else. One of the most famous tracks, and coincidentally my favorite, is Untamed Heart, and just listen to this. This song is paired with one of the game's best levels, and it all comes together to show some of the best of what the PS1 had to offer. The way the music pairs with the combined 2D and 3D graphics, and a polished yet grungy design with the dreamy characters. Look, I know I'm gushing, but it really is some of the best atmosphere I've experienced in a platformer from this era. And it's that attention to detail that makes this game so great amongst its few shortcomings. The heart and care that went into crafting its music and visuals, and even the nods to Namco's past, like the Pac-Man pin on Klonoa's hat, the game is just a great experience and shows just how much went into these old games to make sure they stood out from the pack and really had their own identities. Klonoa is the pinnacle of an overlooked classic, packed to the brim with charm and character not often found in the modern era of gaming. It might start off a tad generic with some god-awful voice acting, but if you give it some time, it transforms into a one-of-a-kind experience of great music, charming graphics, and addicting gameplay. Its story is a bit botched for anyone who can't put up with childish voices and hammy dialogue, but it's one worth trudging through for the experience alone. It should be obvious by now, but I absolutely adore Klonoa, and I hope that if anything, this video has you interested in giving it a try. I would love to see this series finally get the exposure and love it deserved for all these years. But with that being said, subscribe, support me on Patreon, follow me on Twitter and Odyssey. I'll see you in the next video.